So this is a video about how to draw in Flash, or alternatively titled, How to Smack Flash's Ass, Make It Your Bitch, and Force It to Do What You Want. First up, here's a few notes on things that inadvertently affect your drawing ability in Flash. If you're exporting for film, make sure that your stage is 1280 by 720 or some variant of 16 by 9. Even if you plan to render at 1080p, you can still go smaller because you can use programs like Swivel to upscale. If you're designing something for a game, use the resolution that your game will be played at in the browser. Most web games won't be full screen, so you don't need to do 1080p. When drawing, you'll notice that your brush size depends on your zoom level. As you zoom in, your brush gets smaller. And this is really annoying, and it's something you have to wind up working around. So, ideally, you want to try and find a good zoom level and brush size that correspond to one another and work well for you, because you will get different levels of post-correction as you draw at different zooms. You'll have less post-correction on things that are zoomed out. Post-correction is basically the big gripe with Flash, largely. Whenever you draw something, you'll notice that the line changes a little bit and becomes something slightly different than what you drew. And that's really annoying, and it's something you basically just have to get used to. If you're used to like those pixel-perfect, precise lines that you get in Psy and CSP, well, you can just go on and fuck yourself, because Flash doesn't like those. Part of the issue isn't all completely Flash's fault. Flash is a vector-based program, so when you're drawing these strokes and stuff, these are not actually lines. These are actually fills, much like with the paint bucket. If you actually take the sub-selection tool, or the direct selection tool, you'll actually notice that all these lines have outlines and stuff, and these are actually shapes, not strokes. Additionally, one other small note is if you're in Animate CC, there's actually an option to lock the set brush size regardless of the zoom. So one thing in regards to Flash that isn't exactly Flash's fault either is also brush control. When you're drawing lines and stuff, faster lines are typically going to be smoother. This is true regardless of what program you're in, and it's not something that's unique to Flash. So if you're drawing super slow, steady lines and stuff, and then you're getting mad over how they're choppy like this, that's your fault. That's not Flash's fault. You've become crippled on a stabilizer. It just winds up becoming more emphasized in Flash because it has the additional post-correction. If you're operating over a larger area in a shorter amount of time, the post-correction will operate over larger sections, so it'll come out smoother. Flash also has an option on the brush tool where you can edit the setting. I typically have mine at 40. By default, it's at 50. Usually you want anywhere between 20 and 60. If you set it too low, however, this is what happens. You get exactly what you draw here. Almost exactly. See how lumpy that looks? Well, it gets worse. Look at all those nodes. All those control points. That is a nightmare. Don't do this. You will have a bad time. That's why you want to keep the smoothing up a decent bit. Some smoothing is good. Anyway, those were nodes, and I'll go over them in a second, because those are actually going to be very, 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 very important. So to review, you want to find a good zoom range, and you want to find a good brush size, and you just want to keep those consistent. And you just want to understand what sizes you can get for whatever ratios of zoom to brush size. So also for the purposes of this tutorial, I'm going to call strokes anything that is the outside path of these things. These little green lines here, these are strokes. And then the inside of that, I'm going to call paint. So whenever I'm using the brush tool, this is going to be paint. So first things first, Flash has a few brush settings that you can also do. If you go over into the corner here, these are the brush modes. Paint normal basically just paints something as you see it. And it's nothing special and everything. If you draw over top of things and stuff, or if you have like a shape, if you draw over top of it, it will clip over top of it. And you can see how it's breaking that up. So then the other option is paint fills, which this only goes on the inside. This will only replace fills, and it goes behind the line art if you're dealing with strokes. Strokes are the outlines. The other mode is paint behind, which that will cause it to show up behind everything else. So that's actually kind of useful for sealing off gaps and things like that. There's paint selection, which you have to make a selection, and then you can only draw inside that selection. That's actually super useful. I use that all the time. And then there's also paint inside, which behaves similarly, except it doesn't require a selection. You just have to start drawing in the area you want to draw, and it will only go in that area. Or it also behaves like paint behind. So those are the 5 methods that you can use to help make art, and they help speed things up, and they're convenient because Lord knows nothing else in Flash is. Now Flash also has another tool for doing strokes and lines and things like that called the pencil tool. Here's a very simple way on how to use this tool. Don't. The pencil tool is utter and complete garbage. You would not ever want to use this for drawing. You know the stupid post-correction issues that the brush tool has? Well, they're even fucking worse with the pencil tool. This is garbage. I fucking hate this. So yeah, don't use it. Or at least don't use it for drawing. You can use it to seal off gaps and stuff, which I'll go into that trick later. And you can also use it for shading, but don't use it to draw. You'll hate yourself. Don't. If you do want strokes, however, there is a clean way to get them, and that is with the pen tool, which if you don't know how to use a pen tool, and no, this is not a simple brush setting, this is an actual tool, pen tools are great. They're one of my favorite tools in any art program, and Flash, honestly, in my opinion, has one of the best ones available, which is surprising. Pen tool is a vectoring tool. It's present in Photoshop. It is the primary tool for programs like Illustrator and Inkscape, and it is where nodes come into play. If you're used to the pen tool inside, this is nothing like that, because that is a misnomer. So the way the pen tool works is it basically makes these little things called nodes, or anchor points. And these things connect strokes together. It's important to note that they connect strokes. Keep that in mind. You can seal them off and everything and make closed shapes and polygons and things like that. It's sometimes also called the polyline tool. If you click and hold when you drag, you can make these little arms come out. And then this can create splines, which can be used to add curvature. The pen tool is a super precise tool that allows you to accurately make whatever shape you want. And this can also be done with a mouse as well. I was using my tablet there. Here's me making the exact same shape with my mouse. Look at that. You can vector just as easily with the pen tool with the mouse as you can with the tablet. So it's a great tool, and it's very, very useful for doing vector art. Even if you don't intend to draw primarily using the pen tool, it's still very useful to know because there are some elements of nodes that you need to understand in order to make your drawings in Flash work. So, as I mentioned, to draw with a pen path, you click to make points, and these make anchors, or nodes, or whatever have you. And the lines will connect between them. There's also a few little icons that appear next to the pen tool whenever you use it. If you notice the X, that means you are making a new starting point. If there's nothing, it means you're continuing from an existing one. If you see a circle, you're making a closed figure and you're closing loop, and that'll terminate that line, and then you'll be able to make a new one. If you click off of it, and then you click the end point of another, you'll see a slash, which allows you to continue from an existing anchor point. You can even continue from other center points in Flash, which isn't something that you can commonly do with a lot of other vectoring programs. That's one reason why I like it so much. It can also cause a few problems here and there, but you'll get used to it. Additionally, there's also a few other nodes to make note of. If you select the center of a line, you'll notice that there's also a plus that appears. This allows you to add in new anchor points and things like that. This is very useful if you have a curved line and you want to basically add in an easy manipulator so you can scale its size instead of having to adjust these little limbs here. If you have an anchor point, or if you have anchor points and you hold down Alt, you'll also get the caret tool, which is also called the convert anchor tool, which is also very useful. This allows you to immediately add curvature where there isn't some, or also to reset the curvature of a point if you want to zero it out. Say you want to have a bend here, if you hold down Alt, or you're using the convert anchor tool, you can drag it out, or if you hold Alt again and then you drag out one of the limbs, you can actually extend them out in two different directions so they're no longer tangent to one another. And then likewise, the delete anchor point tool, which you can use to quickly terminate and remove lines that you don't want anymore, and strokes and anchors that you don't want, which is useful for simplifying things. That'll actually come into handy. So there's generally two approaches to drawing using the pen tool. Say you have a sketch drawn out and you want to ink it. The way you do this with the pen tool, there's a few methods. One option is to basically just kind of loosely make a few hard points at key areas around the shape, and then you extend out the arms as you go. This will allow you to get really precise and add in points exactly where you want them and get the curvature going. This is something that a lot of Inkscape users and a lot of Illustrator users will do when they draw. The other method, this is what I usually do, though it's not necessarily always ideal, is I just draw the lines, or I draw the arms as they come out. And you kind of have to work with it a little bit more to understand what this will wind up resulting in. I've worked with the program for a long time and I understand how pen tools work, so I always know almost exactly how my lines will wind up. Usually where I get issues is at the endpoint, as you can see here. It's formed a really sharp corner here. There's a direct selection tool which you can use to actually manipulate nodes individually instead of shapes. Then the general selection tool will just select the entire line or the entire fill. So it's important to know the distinction between those. The white arrow, the subselection tool, is a vectoring tool, and then the selection tool is just a general tool. One other small thing to note about the pen tool and just strokes in general is there's also these things called the join and the cap. If you want sharp corners, you're going to want to set this to miter. It's pretty simple, but all it does is it makes it so that way it'll kind of pull out the strokes. One other thing also with the pen tool, say you want dynamic lines, like you want line thickness like you would get with a brush. See how this goes from thin to thick to thin? If you want that with the pen tool, kind of shit out of luck. Not really. Once you're done manipulating this and you get it into the shape you want and you're completely done, you can go to Modify, Shape, Convert Lines to Fills. Now this is no longer a stroke. This is now paint or a fill. Then what you can do is you can just basically kind of just drag these out and get a little bit of tapering going on here. Voila, you have line thickness. It's very useful if you want to have mostly consistent lines except at the end caps. And you want them to be very, very accurate. Because again, the pen tool is really accurate. It's great. If you're in Animate CC, there's actually variable line thickness that you can apply to the strokes, which is also very useful, you lucky sons of bitches. As far as editing strokes go and stuff, like I've mentioned how you can do this and everything, and you can like add in a point, edit this, tweak it, pull it out, stuff like that. All the stuff that I've demonstrated so far also applies to fills. You can delete these nodes, and you can basically manually simplify things to get a smoother shape. Have a weird random joint going on you don't like? You don't like this? You don't like this section? Just select these. Oops. Don't like these? Just delete them. Like that. Now suddenly this line is a lot nicer. That's largely what you wind up doing in order to tweak your brush strokes and things like that and make them work. Is just edit them using the direct selection tool or the sub-selection tool or whatever it's called. There's also some other tools that you can also use. So like say you have these weird lumps and you wanted these to be one consistent line. You can also just select them, drag them over, connect them. Or if this is like slightly offset or something like that and you need this to go more flush, you can also turn it into a union. All you have to do is go to Modify, Combine Objects, Union. Make a union. And then you can move this individual shape around and it won't wind up merging with everything else. The thing is, when you have two shapes in Flash, if they're the same fill and they overlap one another, they become one object. That's annoying. But you can work around with that by making unions and binding that to a hotkey, and then you can combine them when you're ready. Put them in position, and then ta-da. Then you can break them apart. If you're using the selection tool, one other thing I also forgot to mention is you can actually pull forms out a bit. You can actually tweak things that way, which can be useful. Flash also has two simplification tools, which they sometimes work, they sometimes don't. You kind of have to touch and go with them. There's the smooth tool, which is available from the selection tool. You click it a few times, it'll try to smooth out the shape. Here's something interesting about it though. Like the brush tool, it is also dependent on zoom. It'll get more fine when you zoom in. So if you control your zoom, you can actually you can sometimes manipulate it into doing what you want. Like you don't want this. It's broken this line apart. That's ugly. But if I zoom in a lot and use it, it'll only make small, tiny little changes and stuff. And it makes it work. As you can see, however, it also adds in a lot of nodes. So there's another tool. Go to Modify, Shape, Optimize. You only need to set this to around like 5 or so. Higher values will simplify it more. But what this does is it tries to preserve the existing shape, mostly, but it removes a lot of the nodes, specifically the unnecessary ones. Sometimes it will screw things up. It doesn't like corners, for instance. Actually, there it liked corners. But either way, sometimes it will screw up, and sometimes it'll wind up simplifying areas that you don't want simplified. So another workaround for this is to just make a selection using this marquee tool or the lasso tool, and then use the smooth or the optimize tools on just the areas where you want to work. You don't have to simplify the entire thing if everything is fine except for one problem area. Or if it's just a small enough problem area, you can even just remove it manually. That is how you simplify things in Flash. Now you probably already know what the paint bucket tool is aimed to do and how it works. Basically have a shape, take a fill it in. Wow, that is an ugly red. I'm going to make it lighter. So sometimes you'll get a behavior where you go to use the paint bucket tool and you go to fill it and it won't fill. If you zoom in, you'll notice that there's like this little gap here. However, sometimes these gaps will be so tiny that you can't actually visibly see them. They're literally less than a fraction of a pixel away from one another. And it kind of gets frustrating because when you're zoomed out and stuff, like you wouldn't notice that gap if you were to zoom this out this much. You'd have to scour the place for it, and you have to try and figure out how to fill it. The built-in tool that it has to circumvent this is it has the ability to close gaps. However, sometimes, depending on the size, it'll wind up closing off a bigger gap than you want. Obviously, it's not doing this now, but it will wind up closing off like a portion like that, and it will leave this big, ugly white space. So I don't like to use the close gaps tool. There's two methods that I typically use myself to get around this. There's more, obviously. One thing I will do is I'll do a diagnosis, where I'll basically take the fill color, divide it in half, and see where the error is. Divide it in half again. Oh, the error is there. That means the error is somewhere in this area, and I can identify it as there. And I can seal that off. Alternatively, if I know exactly where the error is, I can just fill it in there and go like that. Another option, this is where the pencil tool actually does come in handy. Choose a bold, obvious color that you'll notice, and just draw a little stroke. Make it tiny. Around where you want it to fill. Fill it in, and then double-click the stroke to select it, then click Delete. That is one area where the pencil tool actually does come in handy. The other area is for shading. Then you can just do the same thing. So the pencil tool can actually be used for shading and a little bit of coloring. Just don't use it to draw, because it sucks for that. Some other tools Flash also has is if you're dealing with gradients, you're not stuck with just the default position. If you go to the gradient transform tool, you can actually scale this around, you can move it around. The gradient editor is actually pretty intuitive, so I'm not going to explain how it works. Pretty obvious. We'll explain that radial gradients and stuff, they have scale, wash, rotate, and skew the center point. So those are the elements of that. There's also another tool that Flash has called the free transform tool, which this is one of my most used tools, and it's great. By default, it's Q. If you hold down Control, you can actually scale things in perspective and things like that. It also has option to other elements, so you not only can scale and rotate and things like that, you can also do this thing called an envelope transform. You'll like this. It allows me to basically kind of manipulate things and give it a weird level of bend. You see these little arms coming off? They behave just like vector nodes. That's why vector nodes are so important to learn how they work. And learn how they work, and you will enjoy drawing in Flash a lot more. I can guarantee it. So yeah, you can add in some unique bends, things like that. It's very useful for doing deformations and things. So learn how it works. So here's some hot tips to learn how to draw faster in Flash. Say you have two lines that go like this, and you need them to go at a corner, and you're drawing using the brush tool. Well, take the selection tool, go to this corner, just pull it out a little bit. Ta-da! Then you can add in a lot of sharp corners and things like that. Sometimes it works. Usually it'll work. Sometimes it'll get a little bit annoying and you have to wrestle with it. But you have to wrestle with everything in Flash, so get used to it. So then I have all these little pieces that I can delete, and I can delete them by hand if I want. But a faster way to delete them, kind of draw a path between them, because remember, they'll combine. And I can select them all at once, delete. Ta-da! Oh, there's also the eraser tool, which avoid using it if you can. Sometimes it'll work right. Sometimes it makes a lot of excess nodes that you don't need. So use it sparingly. Be smart. As I've demonstrated in other parts of this tutorial and stuff, is if you have elements that are problematic, instead of selecting everything at once, select just the area you need to edit. You can trim it out there. You can use the subselection tool to delete packages of nodes as well, if you have too many. That way you don't have to work with every single node at the same time. That way you only have to fix certain areas. If a node doesn't have a limb coming out of it, you can hold down Alt and you can just redraw half, or redraw that node. Change its Bezier curve. Other things worth noting. Say you want to do like a blush or something, we'll just make a random circle, delete the outline, and change it to a radial gradient. You can just make this pink. You can apply transparency to a gradient. when you're selecting it, it'll actually show at full transparency, but when you have it deselected, it'll show just like that. Then you can scale this around. I like to convert them into unions so I don't lose them. And then you can apply these where you need. Ta-da. So I've told you about all these cool things that you can do to make your drawing time in Flash a lot easier, but I haven't told you about what you shouldn't do. Number 1. If you're noticing issues with the drawing and stuff, like say a line doesn't show up after you draw it, you're probably about to crash, so you're going to want to save and then close Flash out and reload it. One other thing to note is that if you're drawing inside of a symbol, and then that symbol is inside of another symbol, and then that symbol is inside of another symbol, sometimes you'll get some weird behaviors. The smoothing tool will wind up, or the post-correction smoothing will wind up getting more and more dramatic. Sometimes you'll even wind up with an issue where, I can't recreate it here, where the pen tool will basically like make paths, and then like you'll go to draw the next node here, but it will appear all the way up here, and it will be disconnected and disjointed. Easy solution around that, take the original item, paste it into the main timeline, remove the transformation on it, and just draw it from in there. It'll still appear in the main symbol and stuff. If I want to give this thing a red eye, you can see that it appears on the original one as well. So you can use that to basically add in elements if you don't want to deal with the skew and everything, because Flash doesn't have a camera, or at least it doesn't have a rotatable camera or anything like that. Animate does have a moving camera now, and it does have rotation. By far, though, one of the biggest pieces of advice that I can give for Flash is to draw big and then scale down. If you're drawing really small, it becomes a lot harder for Flash to basically kind of like calculate things, because it does have a minimum size. Like, I can't zoom in any further than this. It's a lot easier to draw big and then scale down to the size that you need. So do that if you can, because you'll be able to get a lot more precise and a lot more accurate. So some other notes: if you need to move something around on the screen, make it into a symbol before doing so. Because if you just try to animate this, say you have a keyframe here, goes here to here, and then you tween this. By the way, use classical tweens, don't use motion tweens. This will create items called symbols named tween. Yeah, these are both named tween1 and tween2. That means these are two completely different objects. This one can be blue, this one will be red. And the terrible thing is that if you get two of these that are named the same item, they'll wind up overwriting one another, or they might crash the program. So yeah, if you do this, you are probably going to crash your program, and you probably deserve whatever hell you've brought upon yourself. Make it a symbol before tweening it. Don't just go and tween it. If you're getting things named symbol 1, symbol 2, symbol 3, or tween1, tween2, you're doing it wrong. Don't do that. It's a bad time. Just be like, Becky, I got you blue. And now I can tween this around however I want. And it'll be the same object here and here. I would also recommend actually going in and binding, if you don't have the Janimation tools, bind a classic tween to a hotkey that you use frequently, just because you're going to be using this a lot. I did mention that you can convert strokes into fills, which, if you're going to be skewing and scaling something a lot, I'm going to show you why you actually would want to do that. Make a rectangle. I'm going to make the lines really big, just for visual purposes. Fill this box. Now watch what happens when I scale this. And I'm going to make another one, put this aside. I'm going to convert this into fills alone and make that a union, so that way they both behave like objects. If I scale this one horizontally, the line thickness changes according to the average width. If I scale this one horizontally, I get thicker lines on top and thinner lines on the sides. You might want the line thickness to be consistent, but that's just one thing you have to take note of, because the line thickness will be very unpredictable. As you can see, it gets really thin when I skew it that way, but really thick when I skew it this way. Whereas this one behaves consistent in all directions, because these are fills, not strokes. It tries to draw the strokes as if they were appearing on the main timeline. So yeah, that is one thing to note. Yeah, as you work with Flash more often, you'll basically get used to the crashes, and you'll kind of be able to figure out when it's going to crash, so you can anticipate it and predict it. Another thing also that I would like to note, don't rely on bitmaps for Flash animation, because they will lag Flash to hell and back, especially if they're big. They can work fine for backgrounds and stuff, but actually animating them, let me give an example of a bitmap in Flash. So first things first is that it does artifacting on it. You can get around this by going to Properties, change it to lossless, and it will show up exactly as it originally exists. Problem with Flash and bitmaps is that if you symbolize this, scale it, well, when this renders out, it's going to wind up looking blurry. Likewise, same thing will be true if you zoom it up. And here's the real issue with it. The big issue with bitmaps and stuff in Flash is that if I were to like break this down, then try to edit it, I can't do anything to edit this. I'm literally stuck with this. I can't really do anything with this. This is not helpful for Flash animation, which is meant to be dynamic. If I wanted to do frame-by-frame sequences of this, I can't. I'm just kind of stuck with a single static object. And also an object that also potentially, if I animate it around enough, it's going to potentially crash the program. It's going to be a mess. You don't want to do this. Don't do this. Instead, what you want to do, you can import an image. Sometimes what I'll do is I'll make another layer over top. Draw on a big rectangle. White. Transparency. Lock that layer. And now I can draw over top of this. And the thing with Flash is that you don't have to be precise. I'm going to objectify those eyes. That way I can move them around later. And then I just kind of work with it. I just kind of go. I have an understanding of zoom levels and things like that. So I know exactly how zoomed in I need to be to get the shape that I want. So yeah, that's roughly about how I would draw in Flash. If I double click in Union, by the way, I can go in and I can just edit only the Union parts. Yeah, it's fully possible to draw in Flash, and it's frustrating at first. You get used to it. You just gotta make it your bitch. So yeah, hopefully you found this all helpful and everything. Big thank you to my Patreon supporters for supporting me and letting me make these tutorials and stuff. So yeah, if you're 18 or older and you want to be a Patreon, you can go for it. Links over in the description, and there's boobs there, so I know y'all like boobs.